Everyone. Angela, if you can start recording. Good evening, everyone. My name's Andy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of Environment and Infrastructure at the Town of Midland. And tonight we're going to be having a public information session on our wastewater master plan. Our consulting team, led by Jane Wilson at Yale Richards, will be doing the presentation. And I'll turn it over to her so she can go through some of the formalities of the meeting and how we'll go about handling questions and answers as we go along. Jane?
Thanks, Andy. I'll see if I can. All right, thanks, Andy. As Andy said, we're here tonight to talk about the Midland Wastewater Master Plan. I see we've got a great turnout. There's almost 24, 25 people here. So this might be almost a record-breaking master plan presentation for me. Oh, 24, we're getting really close now to the record. And so tonight I'll be going through the preliminary findings of the Town of Midland's wastewater servicing study. Before I begin, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have a question throughout the presentation, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box, and you can click that at any time and type in a question. I'll stop a few times during the presentation to answer questions, and then there'll be an open Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions, there's no question too small, there's no question too hard. We'll answer all of them, or at least attempt to answer them. So take the time throughout the presentation and at the end to throw some questions in there. If you prefer to ask your question out loud, that is also an option. And so to do that, you need to use the raise your hand function. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a little hand that you can click. If you don't see that little icon, you may have to click on participants, and then you'll be able to find your name. And in the dropdown, you'll be able to raise your hand. And so if you've got a question, you can use the Q&A, raise your hand. If you're joining us by telephone and you'd like to raise your hand, just hit *9. And we'll see that your hand is raised, and then we'll unmute you when we get to the opportunity to ask your question. And so getting into the actual reason we're here tonight is the master plan. And this master plan is following the Municipal Engineers Association class environmental assessment process. And this process has been developed to ensure that the environmental impacts associated with potential water or wastewater projects are considered and mitigated before any of these projects go ahead. And so under this framework, projects have been identified as being either Schedule A, Schedule B, or Schedule C projects. And within this framework, the level of complexity and the potential for environmental impact goes up as you move from Schedule A to Schedule B to Schedule C. And so this master plan is being conducted as an approach to master plan, which means that all Schedule B projects would be approved at the completion of this project. And so Schedule B projects are things like wastewater pumping station expansions, storage facilities, that kind of thing. Schedule C projects would be more complicated projects like a wastewater treatment plant expansion or even a new wastewater treatment plant. And those studies would require, or those types of projects would require further study beyond what we're doing in this master plan. And so part of this framework is going through these two phases. And the first phase is identifying the problem and opportunities. And then the second phase is identifying potential solutions to address the problems that are identified. And then once we have a preliminary recommendation on how to address the issues that have been identified, we can consult with the public and other stakeholders. And that's really what we're doing here tonight, is looking to get some input from you on the recommendations we're making before they're finalized and documented in the project file report. There will be an opportunity to provide comments during this meeting and after this meeting. There will also be a formal 30-day review period of once the report is drafted. And so that formal 30-day review period will likely occur in the new year, and that would be after this report goes to council. And so that's the general approach the master plan is following. Looking next at the specific objectives of the Midland Wastewater Master Plan. The goal of this master plan, and really of all master plans, is to put together a roadmap for infrastructure development for the sort of near term and for the long term, to make sure that you can address the needs of the existing community and of the future community. Specifically with the Midland Wastewater Master Plan, we're looking at mitigating the impacts of combined sewage overflows on Midland Bay and Georgian Bay. We're looking at the need for infrastructure renewal as infrastructure is reaching the end of its life. And then perhaps most importantly, we're planning for growth. So looking at what we need to construct to meet the needs of the future needs of the town. To do that, we've followed 4 relatively straightforward steps that I'll walk through tonight. The first is to identify the existing infrastructure, look at what its existing capacity is, how old it is, its performance, and then look what we need to, what is required for growth in the next 20 years, and we'll also look beyond the next 20 years. And then what we've done is we've simulated or modeled what that future condition looks like to identify what some of the deficiencies may be within the system as you start to accommodate that growth. And then once you've identified the deficiencies, we'll look at ways that we can address them both in the near term and in the longer term. Before I get into the specifics of the system, does anyone have any questions on the master plan process or the process that we followed throughout the study? Great, seeing none, I will keep going. So this is the Midland Wastewater Collection System. For those of you on the phone, it's a map of Midland. It shows a number of black lines that have arrows indicating the direction that the wastewater flows in the pipes. Within the town of Midland, there are 3 main collector sewers. So at the north part of town, you have the Bayshore trunk that's shown here in pink. In sort of the middle of town, you have the Young trunk shown in purple. And down in the south, you have the Pillsbury trunk shown in green. And so if you want to do something fun and interactive at home, you can find your house on this map. You can figure out where your wastewater enters the system, and you can follow these little arrows all the way to the plant. I know we have a couple of people on the call from Georgian College, and there is a campus down at the south end of town on the Pillsbury trunk. So all of those students following along, you can imagine where campus is. You can follow the black arrows into the top end of the Pillsbury trunk. It would then follow all the way down the green line to the wastewater treatment plant, which is where that green star is. And so anyone can do that. And then when you're driving around, you could think about where all this wastewater is going underneath the road. Right now, there are 7 sewage pumping stations in the town, and these are for areas that wastewater can't flow by gravity into the trunks. So wastewater flows to these pumping stations, and then it's pumped from the pumping stations into the main trunks, and from there it goes to the plant. The largest pump station in Midland is the main pumping station on Bay Street. It's the blue dot just to the, I guess, left of the wastewater treatment plant on your screen. Saw there was a question. Does the Young Street, so the question is, does the Young Street trunk sewer still run behind houses between King Street and Queen? I don't know the answer to that, but there are some parts of the trunk that do run through, like outside of the road right allowance. I don't know, Andy or Mitch, if you know the answer to that question.
I'll see if Andre or Chuck can answer that question.
Yes, there is a section where the sanitary sewer does run behind the homes on King, the apartment building in between the park of Little Lake.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Certainly, if you've got any other questions about specifics, there are some operators here that can jump in on anything. So that's the existing collection system. And yeah, you can see that the Young trunk, it actually doesn't follow Young Street exactly. It dips down and then comes back up to Young. And so the next thing we'll look at is the age of the collection system. There are pipes in the ground throughout Ontario that are well over 100 years old. That doesn't mean that you should keep pipes in the ground for that long without replacing them. Typically, we look at replacing wastewater sewer mains around the 60-year mark, somewhere between 60 and 80 years. And so if you look at the Midland collection system on your screen, you can see that the pipes in red are all those that are older than 60 years. Some of those sections have been replaced in the last couple of years, but you can see there are a number of sections in sort of the original part of town where the sewers are older than 60 years. And so once we looked at the age, the next important thing was to look at was the capacity of the existing trunk system. And so what we look at here is we want to make sure that when you flush the toilet, and even on an ordinary day or on a very rainy day, that there's enough capacity in these sewers to convey all of the sewage to the wastewater plant. So we don't want it backing up into people's homes, and we certainly don't want flooding at the surface. And so what we did is we built a computer model to look at the impact of different rainfall events on the collection system. And so we ran the simulations for a 1 in 5 year storm, a 1 in 10 year storm, and a 1 in 100 year storm. And so a 1 in 5 year storm is a relatively small storm that you would expect to happen approximately once every 5 years. These 1 in 100 year storms are much larger, and you would expect them to occur less frequently. However, you want to make sure that your collection system can handle the flows that would occur under any of these events. And so you can see in this figure that there are a few sections on both the Bayshore trunk and the Young trunk, actually also the Pillsbury trunk, where there is the potential for basement flooding. That's all the circles that you see under these different rainfall events. It's a little bit hard to see on this figure, but there are also a couple of X's on the Young trunk, and that's where there's the potential for surface flooding. And so there's a need to increase the capacity of these sewers in order to make sure that all the wastewater is conveyed to the plant, particularly during larger storm events where there is the potential for larger flows in the system. Under the existing service population, there are no all of the sewage pumping stations have adequate capacity to treat the flows. So this really means that at this point, most of the wastewater that enters the system or all of the wastewater is making its way to the plant. And so looking next at the wastewater treatment plant, this is your wastewater treatment plant. This is where, I like to think all of the magic happens. And so I'll talk briefly about how this process works, just so you have some idea. And it's less of a mysterious black box that you drive by and pretend doesn't exist. And so wastewater enters the front of the plant. This is called the headworks. And here is where all the bigger pieces of waste get screened out. So this is things like if sticks get through, if flushable wipes get through, the headworks is there to catch those big things. Rags are another example. So making sure that you don't flush those things down the toilet is important. It makes the headworks jobs much easier. And so that's really the first stage in this process. The next process is the primary clarifiers. And in the clarifiers, the wastewater velocity is slowed down so that some of the other smaller particles can settle out. And so those particles settle to the bottom of the clarifiers. And then from there, if I go the right direction, and then from there, the wastewater is sent to the aeration tanks. And the aeration tanks, like the name suggests, air is added. And this helps bacteria to grow, and those bacteria are what help to treat the wastewater. From the aeration tanks, it goes then to the secondary clarifiers. They work in a similar way to the primary clarifiers. Again, the velocity is slowed down so that all that bacteria and waste can settle out to the bottom of these tanks. And then from there, the wastewater goes for disinfection. Because it's being discharged to Midland Bay, it has to be disinfected, in this case with chlorine, and then has to be disinfected with chlorine. And then the chlorine has to be removed so that it doesn't impact the wildlife in Midland Bay. And so then from there, it goes to the outfall out to Midland Bay, ultimately to Georgian Bay. I see a question about microplastics. The question is, what would we need at our plant? Is it a natural solution like organisms or mechanical process like screening? So this is a really interesting question. Microplastics, for people who aren't aware, are essentially very, very small particles of plastic. They enter our wastewater stream through a variety of different sources. One of the most common, though, is from your washing machine. So when you wash things that have synthetic fibers, that's like polyester and that kind of thing, these fibers get washed off your clothes. they go into the system and they make their way to the plant. Ultimately, they can make their way into the environment. And there have been concerns in recent years about the impacts of large quantities of these microplastics on the health of the ecosystem. And so this is a secondary treatment plant, which means, like I said, there's screening already at the beginning of the plant, and a lot of large particles filter out in the primary clarifiers. So one of the main mechanisms of treating for microplastics is actually screening and in the primary clarifiers. So I think about 70 to 80, don't quote me on that, % of microplastics that have entered the wastewater plant are actually removed in these first two processes. Beyond that, there's not a lot of removal. And so there is still the potential at this plant for microplastics to enter the environment. One of the best things you can do is to eliminate them from entering the system at home. And so there are things that you can put on your washing machine, like they're sort of, I don't know what you'd call them, filters, or but you can put them in your washing machine to collect these microfibers so that they don't go into the system. And in terms of how to actually treat for them, this is really an emerging issue in wastewater treatment, and there's not a lot of consensus on what the best way is to treat for them and what levels they need to be treated at. Research is still really needed to understand what the impacts of microplastics are on the environment and how to reduce them to levels that would be acceptable. So it's really an ongoing area of wastewater treatment research. I don't know if that answered your question, but screening is certainly one of the ways you can get rid of some of the larger microplastics. And already this plant is screening out plastics. So Q-tips are one of the big plastic pollution culprits, and screens that are already in place at the plant can screen that sort of thing out. But it's certainly smaller plastics than that would need to settle in the primary clarifiers or be addressed through another process. So hopefully that answered the question. We can certainly talk more about it at the end. Are there any other questions on the wastewater treatment process before I go on to look at wet weather flows and wet weather treatment? Great. All right, I will keep going. So in Midland, you are in the unique, although not that unique position of having combined sewers. And so combined sewers are when you have storm sewers that tie into your sanitary sewer. And this means under wet weather events or rainfall events, storm water mixes with the sewage and it has the potential to overwhelm the system. And so when this happens, there right now at the plant and at Chamber A, which is at the main sewage pumping station, a bypass occurs of this combined sewage, which is a mixture of mostly rainwater and some sewage. And so this occurs almost every year in Midland, and there are standards set out by the Ministry of the Environment to mitigate the risks associated with these combined sewer overflows on the environment. And so some of the key requirements of that procedure are that combined sewage overflows can't occur during dry weather periods. This means you can only have bypasses of the plant during a wet weather event. During the, let's call them the wet weather months from April to November, 90% of the wet weather flow has to be captured or treated. So only 10% of it, a maximum, could be bypassed. And as your population grows, there can be no increase in the volume of waste or of wet weather flow that is bypassed. And so that'll become important later on as we start to look at growth within the town of Midland, making sure that those wet weather bypasses don't increase in volume over time. And so there have been some recent changes and improvements in the town of Midland system to help address these wet weather flows. And so the first is the King Street Rejuvenation Project. For those of you that live in Midland, you will be familiar with this big construction project. It recently finished, and part of this work was to separate combined sewers through that area. So now there is a dedicated storm sewer and a dedicated sanitary sewer. So those two sewers are not, or those two systems are not combined anymore. Operators have already observed a pretty significant decrease in the volume of wet weather flow coming from this area. And so that will be something that's important for the town to monitor from now on. The other change is an adjustment to the weir height in Chamber A. So Chamber A is the bypass structure at the main sewage pumping station. You could think of it like a box with a wall between it. On one side of the box, stormwater comes in. On the other side of the box, sewage comes in. On the sewage side, the wastewater is pumped to the main, pumped by the main sewage pumping station. And on the stormwater side, the water goes out and outfall and into the bay. Because of some historical changes to the weir height, it was lowered. So that wall between the two sides was lowered. And this meant that stormwater was overflowing into the sanitary side of the chamber sooner than it should have. And this was leading to bypasses of combined sewage. And so operators realized this was occurring, and just recently they increased the height of that weir, the height of the wall between those two chambers. And this keeps the storm water on one side and the wastewater on the other side for a much longer time, so that you don't get this mixing occurring as soon. And so there's a question here about whether we'll be replacing combined sewers in other places. Yeah, and certainly the town already has a program in place to replace sewers that are at the end of their useful life and also separate sewers. So that's already part of existing plans within the town of Midland. And certainly as part of this master plan, a recommendation would be to continue separating sewers and conducting additional sampling within the system to identify areas where these high wet weather flows are coming from, to look at targeting those replacement or repair programs. So certainly there are already on the books projects to separate combined sewers, or I believe there are, and that would be part of the ongoing work in the collection system as an extension of this master plan and other projects that are already underway. And so this is what happens in, oh, Mitch, did you want to say something?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. Great. So that's the collection side of the combined sewers. I want to talk briefly about what happens at the plant during these big events. So right now, when you have a big storm, wastewater starts entering the plant just like it always does. And then once the capacity of the plant is reached, the surplus flows are diverted to an equalization tank. And so this is just a big tank that fills up with the combined sewage. And then once the storm is over, it can be pumped back to the plant and treated through the usual way. And so this is what happens during let's call it a medium storm. But during a very large storm, what happens is wastewater comes into the plant, it accepts as much as it can, and then once that capacity has been reached, flows are diverted again to this equalization tank. If it looks like the equalization tank won't be able to hold all of the flows that are coming in, the plant is then bypassed. And these flows are put out through the outlet and into Midland Bay. Some treatment occurs, but it's not the same level of treatment as if the combined sewage was treated through the entire plant. And so again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these bypasses are permitted. There are safeguards in place to protect the environment while they occur, but there are guidelines that limit the increase of this volume. So over time, you can't see more volume of stormwater bypassing the plant. So are there any other questions on the existing conditions of the system before I keep going? The main takeaways from the first part of the project, or the first part of the project I want to highlight, are that both the collection system and the wastewater treatment plant have components that are getting near the end of their useful lives. And so there is a need to renew this infrastructure. And Midland does have combined sewers, so you're always going to face this issue of what to do with wet weather flows. The next part of the master plan was to look at growth. Sorry, there was a question on the equalization tanks before I go on. So yeah, you're jumping ahead, Councillor Main. We will get to the need to potentially expand the tanks or the treatment capacity. So we're almost there. So looking now at growth, a key part of the master plan, after we've identified what the existing conditions are and what the existing constraints are, is to identify when and where future growth will occur, to look at what the future implications are on both the collection system and the wastewater treatment plant. And so within the next 20 years, approximately 3,000 new residential units will be built, and approximately 33 hectares of land will be required for employment purposes. And so what we've done is we've looked at all the areas that have potential to be developed, and we've divided those units and the number of hectares of employment land between those areas to get an estimate or a sort of initial assessment of what the 20-year scenario will look like. We also look beyond 20 years to full build out of all of these areas. And this is because, well, there's a pretty good understanding of the total amount of growth that will occur in Midland over the next 20 years. It's very difficult to predict where that growth will occur. And because if you look, a sort of parcel of development in the north doesn't impact the same infrastructure as a parcel of development in the south. And so we looked at full build out of each of these three main areas. So there's the area in the north showed in yellow, that's Sunnyside and Midland Bay Estates. We looked at the impact of all of that being developed on the downstream infrastructure. We looked at the impact of the area around Highway 93 and Palm Beach Road. If all of that was developed, the impact on downstream infrastructure, that's on the Young Trunk. And then in the south, we looked at the impact of Hanson, the area at the intersection of County Road 3 or 93 and Highway 12 and the Brooklyn Golf Course, what the impact of all of that development would be on the downstream infrastructure. And so as I go through, when I talk about the plant, I'll focus on the 20-year horizon because the plant doesn't care where development occurs. But when I'm talking about the collection system, I'll talk more about that beyond 20-year growth because if all 3,000 of those units happen to be in the south, or they happen to be in the middle, or they happen to be in the north, it'll have very different implications on the downstream infrastructure requirements. And then there's another question here about what do we do for areas that are built but non-serviced? So in this study, we included some of the existing not serviced areas, ones that were likely to be connected as services were extended to new development areas. And so this includes the existing areas in Sunnyside and a few other smaller areas. I'm not sure about the 93 corridor from Young to 12. That would be something that would need to be considered sort of later on. We didn't look at actually connecting those properties in, but that could be something considered if there were services extended along that main. It might be easier to answer this question once I get into the recommended infrastructure improvements. But in general, within the urban boundary, the provincial policy statement recommends full servicing. And so that's what we've assumed in general for areas that are within the serviceable area of the town. So they would be fully serviced by both water and wastewater in the long term, at least. Okay, and so once we've added in these development areas, we're able to simulate using the model what the impact is on the infrastructure under these various storm events. And so this shows the impacts under the projected 20-year population growth. Again, remember that this is a very high level estimate about where growth will occur. So this could change depending on where development actually happens. But you can see in this figure that the areas with constraints are very similar to the areas with constraints in the existing conditions. And so this is why master planning is really helpful because if you go to fix those existing issues and you only fix them to meet the existing demands, you would have to potentially pull out those sewers again in 20 years and replace them with slightly larger ones. So what we do in the master plan is we look at the future conditions so that any infrastructure that can be upsized to accommodate growth is, and so that you're not taking out infrastructure before it reaches the end of its useful life because its capacity was reached too soon. And so these areas are similar, like I said, to the existing conditions constraints on the collection system side. When it comes to pumping stations, within the 20-year population projections, they all have adequate capacity. And then looking at the combined sewage overflows and the capacity of the plant. At Chamber A, because of this weir height adjustment, there would be no overflows at Chamber A based on the simulated modeling under any of the rainfall events, but there would continue to be overflows at Chamber B, so that's at the plant. And so these overflows are an increase from what's currently or these bypasses, sorry, are an increase in what's currently bypassed in the plant, and that's not permitted. And so under the guideline, what you need to do is address the increase under an average year. And so in this case, a 1 in 2 year storm, which has sort of a 50-50 chance of happening in every year, is what we use as our average storm. And so you can see in that 1 in 2 year storm, there's a need to increase the storage capacity at the plant by about 1,800 meters cubed, or to increase the wet weather treatment capacity of the plant by that same amount. And so when I get into the options analysis, I'll be looking at 2 options to address that. And so it is either increasing the equalization storage, or it's increasing the actual treatment capacity of the plant under wet weather conditions. Looking to the beyond 2041 population, and this is if all of those areas that I'd highlighted on the first slide were developed. You can see that a lot of the constraints are common to the previous 2 slides, but there is a significant decrease in available capacity along the Pillsbury trunk. And so this goes right from the end of the trunk to almost the intersection of Highway 12 and William Street. And so that would be if all of that development at the Highway 12, County Road 93 intersection was developed. And again, this is where the timing question becomes important. If all of the town's growth is down there, this is not a beyond 2041 population problem. It could be an issue sooner than that, again, just depending on how growth is distributed over time. In this longer term scenario, most of the pumping stations still have adequate capacity. The Bayport pumping station, the north part of town, reaches its capacity. And the main sewage pumping station starts to approach its design capacity. Looking again at the plant, again at Chamber A, there are no bypasses at Chamber A, but there is an increase in the bypass volume predicted at Chamber B, that's at the wastewater plant. And so beyond 2041, you'd be looking at an increase in storage capacity or treatment capacity of 8,500 meters cubed. And that's to keep the bypass volume to the current bypass volumes. Are there any questions on these future conditions before I start to look at some of the options to address these challenges? Great, I will keep going. So sorry, first I'm going to look at the wastewater treatment plant. As I walked through the plant in that earlier slide, you can see that there are a number of different parts to the plant. It's not just one box with one capacity. Each of those processes have a different design basis and a different capacity that's based on a different sort of flow, a part of the flow. And so independent of what happens with regards to wet weather flows, there is a need to look at screening at the plant. So this is the headworks area. It has a theoretical capacity that's adequate to meet future demands, but the actual capacity has been reported to be much less. This is partially because of the types of equipment that are in there right now. They restrict some of the flow through the headworks. The headworks has also reached the end of its useful life, and some of the equipment is obsolete. So replacing the headworks or significantly upgrading it is going to be something that needs to be looked at in the near term. In the slightly longer term, there's also a need to increase the capacity of the primary clarifiers. So those were the unit that came after the headworks. And then there is also an immediate need to increase the amount of oxygen in the aeration tanks. And so that's to help the bacteria grow and treat the wastewater. And that's an existing issue. So when that's addressed, it would be addressed to satisfy the needs for the current population and the 20-year population. Depending on if the wet weather flow capacity of the plant is increased, there's also a need to increase the capacity of the secondary clarifiers and also the chlorination and dechlorination facility. I've got a question on, do we still process septage? And the answer is yes. And as part of this master plan, we included septage in the calculations on the loading to the plant. So we assumed that the septage receiving facility would be sort of used to its maximum capacity in the future. And this is to make sure that there's adequate treatment capacity in the plant to process that waste, which is higher in strength than traditional wastewater would be because it's less diluted. And I'll talk a little bit about septage when I get to the plant slides. Sorry, so there we go. So just to summarize, in the existing conditions, uh, uh, most components of the system have capacity. As we start to look to the 2041 scenario, there start to be constraints at the plant, and that's true beyond 2041 as well. In the pumping stations, the main pumping station starts to reach its capacity near the end of 2041. And the Bayport sewage pumping station's capacity is exceeded in the beyond 2041 scenario. And then looking at the gravity sewers, if you remember back to those previous figures, taking the timelines out of it because they're very dependent on where development actually occurs, there are the potential for constraints within the existing collection system along all of the trunks, and particularly along Pillsbury. And so the first constraint that we looked at addressing was related to the Pillsbury trunk. We looked at 3 different options to address that constraint. For all situations, there is a need for a pumping station. And so that will be common to all options. In the first option, we looked at constructing the pumping station and then pumping into the top end of the existing Pillsbury trunk, and then upgrading the Pillsbury trunk downstream of that connection point. In the next option, you have the same pump station, but in this case, it pumps north to the Young trunk. So no upgrades required along Pillsbury, but a short section of Young would need to be upgraded to accommodate those flows. And in the last option, again, you have a pump station, but in this case, the force main connects further upstream in Pillsbury near the intersection of Highway 12 and William. So you avoid that section that has low capacity. And then there's still a short section downstream of that needs to be upgraded, but not the whole section. And so we evaluated these based on a number of environmental, technical, and economic criteria. Ultimately, the option that we've selected is pumping up to the Young trunk. This has the advantage of being less expensive because there's less infrastructure that needs to be upgraded. It's also advantageous because eventually there will likely be a water main that comes down along that same corridor. And so the force main and the water main could be constructed at the same time. And so this means you don't have to tear up 2 separate sections of road to implement this project. And so the next set of options we looked at was what to do with that additional wet weather flow at the wastewater treatment plant. And so there are really 2 options. The first option is to treat that additional flow during the wet weather periods. And the second option is to expand the equalization storage so that you can divert the flows and then pump them back to the plant once the storm is over. And so under both of these options, there are a number of upgrades required at the plant that are independent of the options. I'll walk quickly through those first, and then I'll look at the components of the project that are specific to the wet weather flows. So I mentioned earlier the headworks. It's due for life cycle replacements, and its actual capacity is less than its design capacity. So it needs to be expanded to reach that capacity. The aeration tanks, the aeration equipment needs to be replaced to make sure that there's adequate oxygen in those tanks to actually treat the wastewater. And that deficiency is under existing conditions, but this would be designed to treat future flows as well. The chlorination, dechlorination system, there's some interest in potentially switching this to UV. And so that would be considered under both options. And under the option where the plant is expanded to treat flows, that disinfection system would also need to be expanded. The septage receiving station, there was a question about septage earlier. There are some concerns about odor impacts from the septage receiving station, and so odor control upgrades are needed there. The other thing is the digesters, and so I talked a lot about where the liquid portion of the wastewater goes. There's also a solid portion that goes to these digesters, and these digesters are near the end of their service life as well. And so some consideration needs to be given to sort of a major retrofit or replacement of those. So those are the upgrades common to all of the options. And then looking specifically at option 1, treating the wet weather flows would likely involve constructing a new secondary clarifier. And so this would mean that you can put a higher flow through the plant so that you need to divert less of it to the equalization tank. And then the other option is to expand the equalization tank. You would need a tank that's similar in size to the existing one. And in this option, again, when peak flows exceed the capacity of the plant, wastewater would be diverted to that tank and then stored until it can be pumped back. Right now, at this point in time, it's difficult to make a recommendation on one of these versus the other. They both have very similar capital costs. And because of the King Street reconstruction project and because of the potential for other sewer replacement projects or combined sewer separation projects, it's recommended that right now the town of Midland continue to monitor flows to the plant and confirm the future flows and the actual requirements. A lot of changes took place over the course of this master plan that may impact the direction that this takes or the capacity required. And so ultimately these projects will be required, but there's certainly an opportunity to reevaluate which direction the town goes with respect to treating those peak flows or expanding the equalization storage. And so overall, looking at all of the projects that are required, the first one is the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant. The next one, I forgot to mention this earlier, but to address the issue with capacity at the Bayshore pump station, that pump station would need to be expanded or a new one constructed to service those lands, along with a force main to connect it into the Bayshore trunk. There are also a few sections of Bayshore that need to be upgraded. The Young trunk has a couple of sections that need to be upgraded. There would be a new Pillsbury trunk sewage pumping station, which actually pumps into the Young trunk. So there would be a pumping station and a force main associated with that. And then there's a short section of the Pillsbury trunk that needs to be upgraded just upstream of the wastewater treatment plant. In addition to those projects, as I mentioned, the town should continue to monitor wet weather flows in the collection system and at the plant to help prioritize projects within the collection system to help mitigate some of those wet weather flows, which may have some impacts on the treatment requirements at the plant. And there's also a bit of further investigation required at that chamber A. There could be some constraints on the stormwater side of that chamber, so not related to wastewater, that need to be evaluated to make sure that stormwater can actually get out of that chamber and isn't overflowing and backing up into the wastewater side of it. Are there any questions on the recommended upgrades? And certainly I can take questions on this at the end. All right. And so the last part of this, and probably the most important part of the class environmental assessment process, is looking at the environmental considerations associated with the options that are being reviewed and recommended. So the first one on this list is odor control, and that's certainly a concern when you have residential areas near a wastewater treatment plant. And so that's partially why the recommendation to add odor control at a septic receiving station. The next thing we look at is location of vulnerable areas to protect source water protection. In this case, the impacts are relatively modest when it comes to source water protection. The overall capacity of the plant isn't recommended to be changed. It would be just the capacity to treat those high wet weather flows which occur for a relatively short duration. And then we looked at the sort of environmental and natural heritage features. Because this site is an existing development, there's anticipated to be not a lot of impact to ecological or cultural heritage features. But because it is located within 300 meters of a major water body, there is the potential for archaeological features to be unearthed during construction. So certainly that would be something that needs to be reviewed prior to any construction on this site. And so I have a question here about was there any possibility of a second new wastewater treatment plant to handle much of the new developments and relieve the old plant? At this point in time, so there's two portions to the capacity of the three main portions to the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant. The first is its average day capacity. And so that's what the plant is really rated for. And that has to do with its everyday ability to treat wastewater that comes to the plant. The next portion is the maximum day demand. And so that's its ability to treat sort of the worst case day. And then there's the plant's ability to treat peak instantaneous flows. And so that's those really high flows that occur at the very worst point of a very worst storm. And so right now the plant on its average day capacity, it has more than enough capacity to get to the next 20 years. So to get to 2041, and it would only be if you needed to increase your average day capacity, that you'd be looking at a major plant expansion or potentially the need for a second wastewater treatment plant. And so because you're just looking to increase the peak wet weather flows, which is during a short duration event, we didn't look specifically at a new plant or moving this plant or decommissioning this plant, because really your options are related to sort of internal treatment processes at the plant. But certainly, and in 2041, you can look forward to this. When the plant reaches its average day capacity, there will be a need to assess sort of the overall treatment plant design and options. And so that would include things like expanding the plant or decommissioning this plant and building another one somewhere else, or building a second plant. But at the size of Midland, there's probably advantages in keeping just one plant. It can be more expensive to operate two versus expanding one. And certainly going forward, there are options to expand wastewater plants that didn't exist in the 60s, the 90s, 60s, 80s, or the 90s when this plant was last expanded. And those will be things that can be looked at probably 15 years from now, or 20 years from now when the plant starts to reach that capacity. And so no, we didn't look at that in this study because we were focused on just treating those wet weather flows, which don't require as significant a change to the treatment processes. So hopefully that answered your question, but I'm certainly happy to follow up on it. And so that brings us to the end of the formal portion of the presentation. I just want to circle back on the requirements of the municipal class environmental assessment process. And so under this process, we need to follow these two phases. So it's identifying the problem and opportunity. We've done that. We've started to looked at what the issues are and identified potential solutions to address them. And now we're at that public consultation phase. And so we can put a check mark next to hosting the Public Information Center. And once you've asked questions and we've answered them, it will be documented in the draft project file report, which will be presented to council. And then once it's been presented to council, it will be issued for the 30-day formal review period. And so I certainly encourage anyone who has questions or comments, if there's something we missed, something we should consider that we haven't, certainly now is the time to bring it to our attention so that it can be included in that draft report, or at least considered before that draft report is issued. And so that's it for me. I'm happy to open up the floor to questions.
And remember, if you want to ask a question verbally instead of typing it, put your hand up, find the button as we showed at the start, and we can take your questions verbally.
See, there's one raised hand. I'll just have to find it. So Lundy Lane, you've been unmuted. You may have to unmute your computer though.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, very nice presentation. Thank you very much. What I'm wondering is, with whatever plan we might choose to treat our overflow and sewage, with this new equipment, would we ever be able to draw water from the bay for drinking water? You know, like putting it through a plant, but since we have the extra water going into the system from storm sewer systems, if that gets fixed, could we ever draw our water from the bay?
So another study is ongoing. It's actually almost completed to look at, it's a water master plan for the community. Right now, the community is on groundwater supply. And so I don't know if there was any consideration given to switching to a surface water source. I know the recommendation was to continue with groundwater. If you have adequate groundwater capacity, it can be much easier to treat than surface water. And so typically that's the recommendation we would make in communities where there is adequate groundwater supply. I don't know, Andy, you may be able to add something else from the wastewater master plan.
Yeah, Rod, you know, we're on December 9th, the water master plan will be in front of council. and then there'll be a 30-day comment period after that. So certainly take a look when that agenda comes out.
Wonderful.
Specifically though, we have sufficient groundwater for the next 15 years at the end of getting close to 2040. We do need to bring a major well online. The town does have the Sundowner well right now that isn't online that would meet that need, but we have to do some more testing on that well. And that will be all discussed in that other project. So maybe we can keep those comments till we talk about water. And the comment just on taking water, surface water out of the bay, it's certainly that type of plant can be added at any time. Certainly there's sufficient treatment. The effluent from our wastewater plant is not at a stage or it meets all the regulations and would not impair our ability to draw water from the bay and treat it for drinking water. If we did need to do that, but a surface water plant would be in the $20 million range to build.
Great. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the question. Yeah, and I'll just remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, you can type it into the chat or you can raise your hand. So the next question is, how far into the future might the concept of treated wastewater reuse for municipal purposes to reduce discharges and municipal water use be? And so this is an interesting question. It's certainly one that would be considered as part of potentially the future water master plan or the future wastewater master plan. There are municipalities now, I mean, looking at the concept of wastewater reuse. It's often a very cost intensive option. And certainly there are lots of opportunities to encourage water use reduction without getting into wastewater reuse. And so certainly the wastewater that is discharged from the town of Midland's wastewater plant, it meets all of the provincial standards. But certainly treating it to a further level could be considered in the future, but it wasn't considered as part of this study. I don't know, Andy, if you had anything else to add on that?
Yes, Jane. Typically, if you want to reuse the effluent from the plant, it's for agricultural purposes because it's high in nutrient value, or you'd be going into an industrial use. And right now within the town itself, we don't have agricultural uses, nor do we have a large an industrial plant that could use that level of processed water. So we haven't looked at it. As far as reusing that effluent into a residential, that, if you're familiar with that, you have to set up an entire gray water system in the town that would basically put a non-potable water to be used in toilets in a house. And in an old town like we have, that's a totally new distribution network that would have to be developed. And again, the cost is certainly prohibitive. And Jane, I'll take the next question. Are the green infrastructure plans in addition to this planning for stormwater diversion? This study today is only looking at wastewater. The town has never done a stormwater master plan, and that is something that we've considered doing, and we'll be having some discussions at the staff level and with council in the coming year or so if we want to start a stormwater master plan. Just in ballpark, that would likely cost $200,000 to $250,000 for that study. And currently it isn't in our current budget, nor have we projected it in next year's budget, but next year's budget isn't in front of council yet.
Thanks, Andy. Are there any other questions? Again, you can raise your hand. If you're on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand. If you're in the chat, there should be an icon at the bottom of your screen.
Maybe I'll just fill in. I don't know if any of the people online are from the Sunnyside area. We get a lot of questions around when might wastewater services get up to Sunnyside. And the challenge right now, it's the cost to do that. And if that development that was shown earlier, Jane, maybe can you flip back to that development screen?
Is that the one, Andy?
I'm not seeing it yet. The one that has the development areas, that one. So you see at the top on Burnell Side Road, there is a large parcel of land that is zoned to be residential at some point. And if that development ever goes ahead, they will have to connect to our collection system. And as a result, the pipes will go through the existing Sunnyside area. And from a cost point of view, bringing individual services to the existing homeowners is likely in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. That would have to be funded by the homeowners. If a developer is putting some of the infrastructure in to support the new subdivision, that would reduce that cost. So at this point, the town doesn't have any plans to put collection into the existing residential development in Sunnyside. And we don't have a timing for when that developer who owns the land to the north would be going ahead. But if they do, that would be time. I would only suggest for the current residents, if they do want to get municipal servicing, that's separately a discussion that needs to be had with your ward councilors and with staff, because that's called a local improvement. And at any time, if there's enough residents who wish to have a local improvement and have those services put in, of which they would pay for aside from the property taxes, we can certainly look at that.
All right, thanks, Andy. I see Councillor Main, you've got your hand up. I'll allow you.
Oh, hello. Oh, thank
we
you. Hello.
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. This was great. Thanks for this presentation. I spent today reading over it, and this was a really good presentation. I loved all the maps, so thank you so much for this. I got a bunch of questions, so I'll just go one at a time. Speaking of that, on basically the built areas that are built but unserviced, is there any on-site technology? I know at some of these conferences, they're always showing technology from around the place, like these little, micro technologies, little, I don't know, they're like little trailers. They're mostly for remote locations, like in the Muskokas, where they have unsurfaced areas. Is that technology that would be appropriate for this type of area, like Midland Point or Sunnyside, or even Golf Link, where it's highly unlikely that we're going to extend pipes out to the periphery of the community? Thank you.
Yeah, so in general, the preference is for, as I mentioned before, full water and wastewater services within urban boundaries. There are certainly exceptions to this rule, but as Andy just alluded to, anytime an area is looking to develop, or a new development is looking to develop on private services, a separate servicing study would need to be conducted, and that's really to confirm that there wouldn't be any negative impacts to the surrounding environment, particularly with respect to groundwater wells, if there are any in the near area. And so as part of this master plan, we didn't look specifically at that. We looked at, in general, accommodating all of the future development on municipal sewers, but there would be an option for developers who are looking at developing areas that are outside of the service area to consider those options. But generally, if you're if services can be extended, that would be the recommendation, unless you were in a remote community.
Thank you. You were talking about microplastics and other things. Well, even gray water systems were brought up. Are you familiar with any other municipalities that have municipal programs around that? Like if you're saying that there's these little washing machine, filters or socks or whatever, is that something that the municipality could look into? I know the town has had rebates for, low flush toilets. Is that something that other municipalities have started?
Microplastics is a relatively new issue, and I honestly don't know if there are communities already that are looking at sort of widespread distribution of, laundry balls the same way municipalities have distributed like faucet aerators in other programs. It's certainly a program that could be considered if there was interest in it. I understand that I think the Severn Sound Environmental Association may be looking into this, and they may have piloted in a few places. I think someone earlier actually posted a link to some of the Severn Sound information. Oh, and it's Georgian Bay Forever. Sorry. Georgian Bay Forever has some pilots in Collingwood. I don't know. Did you want to speak to that? It looks like there's someone here from Georgian Bay Forever. There we go.
Yeah, sure. We'd be happy as Georgian Bay Forever to talk to Midland, and we can bring that in at a staff level. But right now we have 200 filters up in Perry Sound, and we're going to 300 filters in Collingwood, and we're working with the University of Toronto to prove that technology out and do the scientific assessments, which so far are looking really good up in Perry Sound. So I'd be happy to talk to the Midland staff.
Great, thanks for that.
And that was residential, right?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
And those are filters in residential homes on individual washing machines.
Any other
Thanks.
comments on that one from the town before we get to your next question, Councillor Main? Doesn't look like it, so go ahead with your next question, Councillor.
Oh, thank you so much. I was just reading over the report, and I really like how you have a breakdown in terms of percentages about, if it's entirely developer or if it's tax base, and there was kind of some percentages and breakdowns in some of the areas. We had talked about Bomb Beach. Bomb Beach wastewater almost went ahead and it was deferred, as many things were this year. Do you talk about some of the financial tools or a way of, instead of say the town taking the cost upfront, debt financing it and then collecting development charges? Is there other ways to look at it, like having developers pay more upfront? And I know this report feeds into development charges, which refines the number. So can you talk about the growth kind of financials about a little bit? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll actually pass it over to Andy. Our job is to come up with those numbers, and then it's above my pay grade to think about how they actually get funded. But Andy would be able to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, Councillor Main and everyone on the line. Water and wastewater are totally funded by user rates and development charges. So user rates are your monthly bill that you pay for your wastewater usage. That's separate from your property taxes. And we have to increase those rates and manage those rates in a way, one, that they're affordable, but second, that we can pay for fixing our system as it ages, because all our mechanical works, and as Jane mentioned, many items at the wastewater plant and our pipes in the ground, they age over time and need to be replaced, and all of it's expensive to do. This Jane's earlier slide showed over $40 million of new equipment and repairs that need to be made. When we look at Bomb Beach Road and other areas, growth should be paying for growth, and that's done through development charges. And that's where every house, when it's built, or every square meter of new industrial or commercial development in town, we set a cost that is associated with the amount of capacity for water and wastewater that needs to be done in the town. So our challenge with development charges is you have to build the pipes before the subdivision gets occupied. And to do that, if we're saying we're funding totally through development charges, and say there's 100 houses in that new subdivision, and we need to raise $1 million, we don't get all the $1 million until the very last house is built. But you have to pay the $1 million at day one or before day one, so that the pipes are there for that very first house that gets built and occupied. So that's one of our challenges in town and as a municipal government, and we're no different than any other government in Ontario. That, do we have the capacity to borrow money? It's calling to front end that expenditure cost. So we take debt, and then as the development charges come in over time, that pays down the debt that we've received. The other alternative is you say to the development community, the town doesn't have the capacity to borrow upfront that $1 million, for example. So Mr. Developer, you need to pay the $1 million upfront, and then we'll discharge that loan through you once development charges are going. So basically the developer becomes a financer of the pipes instead of the town. And there's always any of these systems that, Palm Beach as an example on the Yonge Street, that dumps effluent or wastewater into the top end of the Yonge Street sewer line. Jane has identified parts of that pipe downstream that need to be upgraded. The developer will say, well, if the pipes are being used by others, and it's called benefit to existing, they shouldn't have to pay for that upgrade. So with any development, there's still typically costs that have to be funded by the ratepayers or taxpayers outside of development. So in the town here, between our water master plan, our wastewater master plan, our transportation master plan, and our parks and trails master plan, there is well over it's likely pushing about $150 million worth of projects that there's only two pocketbooks, the developers and the homeowners, which are the ratepayers. And it used to be there was more government grants that were available. There are some out there, and with COVID, the federal government, provincial government are announcing more, but we get very few grants for water and wastewater. We've made many applications over the last 3 or 4 years for some of our water and wastewater projects, and we've been unsuccessful as a town. We'll still endeavor to get grants, but it's not like the 1980s and 1990s where it was an automatic 1/3 federal, 1/3 provincial, and 1/3 municipal. That 66% funding, which is how the majority of the town system was built back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, none of that funding is available today. It's on a competitive project by project basis. So funding all these improvements is going to be a challenge, and that's a challenge for council through the budget process to figure out what those water and wastewater rates should be. So if you stay tuned for the budget deliberations, that will be coming to everyone here in February.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'll just switch over to the Q&A for a minute, and then we can come back to the other side. So there's a question here about, did we find 1 or 2 large combined sewers that could be separated at a time in the future? There are still a few sections, as I mentioned, of combined sewers, and basically we would recommend that over time, all of these be separated as work's being done in those areas. I don't know, Chuck or Andre, do you want to comment on any specific projects that may be coming up?
Sure. So, we've gone through, a lot of information when it comes to the collection system, and I think 2 of the main ones lie currently within the stretch of Ellen Street, which is a priority, and then along 6th Street from Dominion to about Montreal are combined sewers that, based on our information, have a large impact. So these will likely be projects that we look at in the near future, if you will.
Great, thanks, Andre. The next question in the Q&A was a suggestion that perhaps combined sewage overflow offline storage along one of the larger sewers might cost effectively reduce the load in the plant to the plant. Yeah, this is certainly an interesting suggestion. At this point, we've located that equalization storage at the plant. Consideration could be given to locating it somewhere else, but because of the size and the volume that is required, and because there's already available space on the wastewater treatment plant site. It's nice to keep all of that infrastructure in one area, but certainly that is something that could be considered, although the preference at this point would be to construct it at the plant where you've already got wastewater infrastructure, and you don't have to look at finding a new site for one of these storage facilities. But the intention would be the same. It's to sort of divert that flow so that it doesn't need to go through the plant at the peak of the storm. And so it could technically be anywhere in the system, but in this case, it makes sense to have it at the plant.
Jane, and then when you look at where those overflows might be that you showed on one of the diagrams, they are in built up areas already. So finding a location at those current junctions of potential failure, it makes it difficult to find land and to put tanks in. And also having tanks out in the field, you do have to clean these after they fill because material does settle out of them. So they are a high maintenance item, and having it at the wastewater plant where we already have operators and ability to work makes it much easier and more cost effective, I would think, to put that at the plant if we go that direction.
Yeah, and so that's where we've shown it for now. Councillor Main, it looks like you've got another question. You're next in line here.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I got lots of questions. One thing that was exciting, we were talking about the last couple of years, but it doesn't sound like it's feasible, was collecting some of the natural gas as part of the process at the plant and looking at maybe like a small little cogen or natural gas little, heat to electricity kind of plant. Is that like, has anyone taken a look at that feasibility report as part of this? And is that any likelihood, especially if we're looking at doing any expansions at the plant?
We didn't get into the details of cogeneration. I don't know, Chuck or Andre or Andy, would you like to answer that one?
I'll take that. That proposal that was written a few years ago was, I'll say, not economically feasible. It was more about when electricity rates were at the 70 and 80 cents a kilowatt hour, which those programs don't exist. So I doubt if you could even make a business case at 10 cents a kilowatt hour or less than 10 cents that since all the FIT programs are gone. Right now, one of the upgrades and repairs at the plant is we do have even a challenge keeping our methane contained because we have a leaky roof that is going to cost around $400,000 to $500,000 to fix, and that is one of the projects we have in the plan. So again, this project was looking at how do we deal with the water flows and the effluent. When we look at digestion and alternatives digestion, and at council, we've talked about the LISTIC system a couple of years ago. That discussion would come in if we decide it's time to replace the digesters and what technology do we want to put in to replace the digesters. So this project didn't really get to it too much. They touched it when you see the full report. They've touched it briefly. But again, those are technology changes we could look at to try and mitigate costs for the digestion when that egg digester is not when it's at failure, but when we know it's at end of life, which is about 5 to 6, 7 years from now right now.
Would there be a possibility of switching from the one to the other? I always get them mixed up, aerobic to anaerobic, or would that change the whole process of the plant?
The LISTIC technology, basically it's not aerobic or anaerobic. It is a chemical process that takes up about a quarter of the footprint. It's technology out of the University of Guelph, and it produces a Class A fertilizer. At the plant right now, all our sludge is deemed a waste under regulations, and it's spread on farmers' fields when the fields are plowed in the spring and the fall time, and in between it is stored. So we pay to have a company store our sludge year round and then put it on farmers' fields. Getting away from anaerobic digestion and which we have today gives other opportunities. As I said, this LISTIC technology out of University of Guelph, there's a number of municipalities in Ontario that have implemented it. The cost projection, when Chuck and I looked at it for here, well, it's a couple years old numbers, but likely $3.5 to $4 million for that technology, but replacing the egg digester is likely about 10 million. So we've got a good business case for a future project.
This is super interesting. Sorry, one other question was that young trunk sewer. Yeah, just on the purple marker, it kind of shows that it runs kind of in between a bunch of houses, and I guess that must be the case. It must have been an old, outdated, what do you call it? Easement that runs behind some houses. Is that sewer line is then active? And then the related question to that. So the Little Lake drainage system is not connected in any way to this Yonge Street trunk sewer. That is a separate storm trunk sewer that runs down Colburn.
So I can talk about the first question. I didn't go through it in the presentation, but we did look at what the cost would be. So Yonge Street, yes, it does do. You can see in the picture, it does sort of a dip down off of Yonge. There's two, it's hard to see, but there's an area where you can see there are sort of two parallel sewers running. You can see there's that little blip, and that's where there's two sewers running side by side. And so there are areas where that trunk does some, I would call it unconventional things. And we looked at the cost of realigning that trunk. So there is work planned on the water main along Yonge. And so we looked at the cost of realigning the Yonge trunk along Yonge Street as part of that project. And the costs are so high, it's not justified because there are no other major constraints in that trunk. It doesn't make sense to realign the whole thing. If there had been a capacity constraint in more of that section that dips down, there might have been a better business case, as Andy puts it, for realigning that trunk. But at this time, because the capacity is adequate through most of that existing route, we didn't recommend realigning it along Yonge to get it out of those easements. And the second one on stormwater, I'm not sure. Andy, can you answer the stormwater question?
I'm not sure, Councillor Main, what exactly you were mentioning there or asking.
It just looks like there's a little bit of overlap. The Yonge trunk sewer kind of exits, and I know that the Little Lake has an outlet in and around that sewer system in and around King Street near the Huroney Museum. And I guess that there's a storm trunk sewer. It must be a separate issue. So it's not I don't believe it's a wastewater issue.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a connection into our storm.
Hi, Jonathan. I've had a quick look at that while we were chatting. It appears on our GIS, it's a separate system and they're not combined in that point. If that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
The next question that's online there, it says there's a tall white tower bubble unit that stands close to Bay Street that is showing rust. Will that exterior of the unit be fixed to prevent further damage? That is this digester that we've been talking about. That's an anaerobic digester. It's basically a metal tank, and what you see on the outside that's white is fiberglass insulation because we're holding the heat in so the bacteria will grow inside that chamber. And that egg digester, we call it, it's 25 years old right now. Its service life when it was built in the 1990s was 25 years, and that is that piece of equipment that we've done some inspections on it. We did some work on it. We know we can get another 5 years out of it. Will we get 10 years out of it? Not likely, but that's that piece of equipment that if we replaced it could cost $10 million to replace, or if we totally change our technology, might only cost $4 million to $5 million to change. So yes, that is an old piece of equipment that's nearing its end of life.
Thanks, Andy. Are there any other questions for the chat or hands to up? Oh, we've got one more from Councillor Main.
Thank you. Yeah, one more. I appreciate the limit.
Well, two more. You can ask as many as you want.
Very much appreciate everyone's time. This has been really informative. Back to the Chamber A and infiltration. That was the one thing we were really excited about, was how much the water levels would go down once we replace King Street. And so you're saying that we basically just should keep an eye on, like, is that part of an infiltration, like I&I study, or is that just ongoing monitoring of that chamber just to make sure that our water levels are low so we don't hit any overflows? Because that seems to be a very large concern for the community.
Yeah, so it's probably two things. So there could be ongoing monitoring in the collection system, and that would be related to better understanding where the sort of highest wet flows are coming from in the system, to better target some of these replacement programs. And the other part of it is monitoring the total flow to the plant, to see if there is a decrease or the amount that's coming from the main sewage pumping station. And so it'll be probably a combination of those three things, of looking at flows in the collection system, looking at them at the Main Street pumping station, and then again at the plant, to see if there is a trend towards lower flows during those wet weather events over time.
Councillor Main, during the construction of King Street, we believe we saw about 1 million liters a day reduction in I&I, so rainwater into that system. And given, we've only had a few months to see that change, we're not really sure if that's going to be a steady state or not. But if it is, that's wonderful news. And that 1 million liters a day wasn't coming during a rain event. It was coming from the groundwater, and we had leaky pipes, and that water was getting into our broken underground pipes that were, approaching 100 years old. So we have to do some more analysis and just, really see how the system performs over the coming 12 months through different rain events to see if we actually got a 1 million liters a day reduction in I&I.
Thanks, Andy. We've got another question in the Q&A. During the flushing in the late spring and early summer, there seemed to be some skunky water. Do you know what that was about? I'm wondering, maybe Chuck or Andre, if you can answer that one.
Yes, that was, I'm not sure about the skunky water. It seems like you're referring to the flushing of the water distribution system, and you get colored water, and you in the system when we do that flushing, it's only a temporary thing, and it's maintenance to the pipe to remove the sediments within the water pipes. But that's with the water system, not the wastewater system.
Thanks, Chuck. Right, we're approaching 8:30. Any more questions before we close things out for tonight?
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Again, this is an ongoing process. This is a public information session, and we're taking your comments tonight. There'll be an opportunity for you to submit any written comments you'd like us to ensure that we've included as part of it through the municipal class environmental assessment. Any written correspondence you give us with questions, we have to include it in the public documents that go to the Ministry of the Environment for review, and we have to comment on them. At this point, this study will be wrapping up in January. We'll be taking a report to council either in February or early March. We have to see how many comments we get and how much other analysis we need to do. And then when this report goes to council, that's when the official 30-day or another official 30-day comment period happens before we get to finalize it with the Ministry of Environment. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone who attended. And unless there's any last questions, we'll call it a night. And I really appreciate Jane and Jill Richards. They've done a great job going through this. The town has never had a wastewater master plan before. This is a major undertaking. Jane talked about the modeling of our system. we never had a computer model for all our collection system. And we spent, or they spent time basically surveying our entire network of pipes. And now that that work is done, that's, the pipes don't change year after year. We'll have a lot more knowledge and ability to manage the system going forward. And it's a huge expense to the town. It's a huge environmental service that we provide to our ratepayers and citizens. And it's a piece of infrastructure that will last forever if we keep working on it, because it ages over time. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.